Hey everyone, my name is Prashanth Iyer, and like Peter Flynn mentioned yesterday on the Winging in Motown website, he mentioned that I was going to do an analytics webinar to address some of the questions that had come up over the last couple of weeks. And as more and more people start to familiarize themselves with analytics, there's a lot of questions about how to use the tools that are available and even how to get started. So I thought I'd take a little bit of time to try and explain the best that I can some of the things that have come up in those questions. And you guys did a great job, almost 100 questions between Twitter and Winging It Motown. So I tried to compile all the questions that I received into different buckets. So we'll kind of go through that one by one. So the first question that I'll start with is just about me and how I got into hockey, so you guys can learn a little bit more about myself. So I grew up in Groseal, Michigan, which is just outside of Detroit. It's actually a small island in the middle of the Detroit River. And growing up there, you learn to skate before you learn to walk. And so I had ice skates on my feet by the time I was, I think, 4 years old. Problem is, I wasn't very good at ice skating. I was not a very good player, and so I took a look. After maybe 5 or 6 seasons of trying to cut it in different ways, I gave up on ice hockey and switched over exclusively to roller hockey, and just played outside, played in the street with my friends. Again, never had any sort of exceptional talents. I like to play as a goaltender because I like Dominik Hasek and I like to flail around, and I thought that was a great way to stop the puck. It actually isn't. Nobody's like Dominik Hasek. You can't really play that style. But in terms of my Red Wings fandom, ironically enough, the first game that I ever had the chance to watch was back in 1997. The one I remember is watching the Brawl, where Mike Vernon and Patrick Waugh fight. McCarty goes after Lemieux. Shanahan, all those guys. Larry Onoff and Forsberg starting the whole thing. That's the first thing I remember about hockey. I may have watched a game before that, but that's the first one I remember. And so surprisingly, fighting and grit got me hooked into hockey. And so I tried not to miss a single Red Wings game at all. I recorded every game, and even though I was recording a game, I couldn't be patient enough to wait to get home. I was checking the score on my phone whenever I could. And so when I was 15 years old, I ended up moving down to Charlotte, North Carolina, when my dad's job got relocated. And the one condition I mandated as a 15-year-old was I'm not moving unless we purchase Fox Sports Detroit so I can watch the Red Wings games, because that wasn't an option for me to miss. And as time has gone on, I've kind of delved and tapped into my background, which right now I'm a second-year pharmacy resident at UNC Hospitals, studying cardiology right now. And so in that background, kind of that science, logical thinking, analytical concepts, I started to get more and more into stats and analysis, because I find that they do a better job of telling us information about complex events where we might not remember everything that we think we saw. And so that's kind of how I got into hockey, how I got into hockey analytics. The first guy I remember reading a lot of was Neil Greenberg, back when he used to write for ESPN Insider. I used to love reading his work over there. And then as I started to learn a little bit more, he actually gave me an opportunity one time to contribute a small piece to his Fancy Stats blog on the Washington Post website. I got to write a small piece about Thomas Tatar, and that was a lot of fun, and that really accelerated my my progress and my love for hockey analytics. And so I've slowly worked on it over the last couple of years, and think I've arrived in a state where I can say I know a fair amount. By no means am I going to call myself an expert. There are plenty of guys and girls out there who are much more knowledgeable than me, but I think what I can do is I can use my skills to try and translate some of what's going on and help teach that a little bit. So we'll start just with some intro to stats questions that I received. And the very first one I received is just, what is Corsi? How do I find a general overview of Corsi, and why does it really matter? And so a lot of the work done on this initially goes all the way back to 2009, 2010, somewhere in that time range. And we had people like Gabe Desjardins, we had Jay Likens, Tyler Dello, Eric Tulsky, all these people working on Corsi. And so in its simplest terms, Corsi is just measuring every shot that's attempted. So that includes shots on goal, that includes block shots, and that includes shots that miss the net. And so it's a sum of all three of those. So we're we're adding up all the shots on goal, we're adding up all the block shots, and we're adding up all the missed shots. And that would be one team's Corsi. And what we're looking for is, and that would be their Corsi 4. Their Corsi against would be all of those, again, all the shots on goal against, all the block shots that they have to block, and then all the shots that miss their own goal. And the way we calculate a Corsi 4 percentage is you take all their shots for, and you take all their shot attempts for, and you divide that by their shot attempts for plus their shot attempts against. And you end up with a number that's that you want to be greater than 50%. Because if it's greater than 50%, that means you are dictating or you are taking more of the shots than the other team. And the reason we use this is, one, by adding all those three types of different shots, the sample size increases very quickly. So a team, may average, even the best teams may average 30, 32 shots a night. But if you add the block shots and the missed shots, now you're talking about a team maybe averaging 70 to 80 a night. And so you're getting twice as many shots accumulating, you're getting a bigger sample faster. And what we end up finding is that you can only shoot the puck, whether it's missed, blocked, or on goal, if you have the puck. And so basically this Corsi number has become a marker for puck possession. And there have been several small studies that have evaluated how it correlates with actual timed possession and found that the correlation is acceptable for us to be able to use this as a surrogate marker or a alternative marker than hand measuring the amount of time a team has the puck on their stick. So that's kind of the first intro. There's a very good basic overview done by Jen-Luc Costello, or you may know her as Regress PDO on Twitter. She wrote a very basic intro piece and a very nice series of pieces on Corsi and Fenwick, which excludes block shots from that above calculation. And she wrote all this on Second City Hockey. And all the links, by the way, that I mentioned today, I'm going to incorporate in this blog post. It should be available to you underneath the video because there's going to be a lot of links that I'm mentioning. It's a lot of great work to familiarize yourself with, and it'll help give you a good overview of what's been done and where we're kind of going with hockey analytics. So just for a nice, basic, easy to read, what is Corsi, how's it calculated? I would recommend that piece by Jen Costello. She's a great writer in terms of making the concepts easy to understand. If you want to get a little bit more in depth in understanding things like score effects, and so in its most basic sense, score effects suggest that as the score changes, there's a change in the way teams attempt shots. And particularly what happens is as teams get the lead, so a team gets up 3-1, 4-1, they go into this thing called the defensive shell. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but what you tend to see is they're more likely to sit back and they're not attacking as much as they usually do. And what ends up happening is the team that's trailing ends up getting a lot more shots once they fall behind, and as they fall behind by a decent margin. And so what ends up happening is you get a disproportionate amount of shots that happen based on these score effects. And so there's an adjustment factor to kind of help adjust for the score effects. And so now we end up with score-adjusted Corsi 4 percentage, or SACF percentage, as you may see abbreviated. And for a little bit more in-depth work on what that is, there's a good piece on Hockey Graphs by Garrick16, who kind of touches on how where we've come with score effects, and then also how neutral zone play is affected by score effects. And then furthermore, there's a nice piece also on Hockey Graphs by Micah Blake McCurdy, who you may know as Ineffective Math on Twitter, who does a little bit more mathematically charged piece on how score effects or score-adjusted Corsi 4 percentage is a very good predictive marker of goals for in the future, as well as correlation with winning percentage. And so I'd highly recommend familiarizing yourself with both Garrick's neutral zone work and Micah's work on the correlation between winning percentage and future goals with score adjusted Corsi for percentage. So that's kind of a good place to get an overview. Micah's piece is a little bit more mathematically charged, a little bit higher level reading. So if you want to start with the basics, or if the math isn't as important to you, Jen's piece would be the best place to start, and then move your way up as you feel necessary in terms of what you want to get out of all of this. And so that's kind of the basic intro I wanted to provide about Corsi, Fenwick, some of these basic metrics that we start with. And then in terms of the people to follow, I've mentioned a lot of names already. I've mentioned RegressPDO, who's Jen Luke Costello. I've mentioned Micah Blake McCurdy, who's in Effective Math. A couple of other names to follow. So Manny Elk, or at Manny Elk on Twitter. He is a phenomenal person to follow. Everyone over at Hockey Graph. So these accounts include at OMG, it's Domi. It includes DTM, Tell Me About Heart, who does fantastic work. He's right now working on a war metric. At mean_63 is another great one. But everyone over at the Hockey Graphs website, Garrett Hole, Pet Bugs, Nick Mercadante, there's a lot of great people, Classlicity over there, Carolyn Wolk, that I would highly recommend following all of them if you want to stay up to date on what's being done now. There's still a lot of great work being done, and Hockey Graphs probably has the best collection of talent that's out there for stats analysis. So I would highly recommend checking everyone out over there, following all those accounts. And everyone's more than happy to help explain something if you don't understand what's going on. So in terms of data collection, I don't do a whole lot of the scraping of data or collecting of data outside of tracking that I do individually. A lot of the data that's collected is scraped from the NHL.com play-by-play reports that are published, and you can find those just on the NHL website, because it publishes all the players who are on the ice, the event that happened, and then we kind of scrape that and turn that into the statistics based on the calculations that are needed to calculate a particular stat. You can find a lot of these a lot of the data, once it's been scraped, is available on websites like stats.hockeyanalysis.com, or Puckalytics is the newer version of that. My favorite to use is Corsica.hockey, which is run by Manny Elk. I think that's right now the best compilation of stats that we can look at. If you want a more visual representation of the statistics, as well as some kind of unique charts out there, Micah's website, or at Ineffective Math's website, hockeyviz.com, is a fantastic reference to use. Micah does a great job with visuals, explaining tough hockey concepts that are easy to follow. And if you don't understand, he's always been more than willing to help anybody I've ever seen who has a question, including me, on his charts. In terms of non-scraped data, or data that's manually tracked, you're probably seeing a lot of that now when it comes to stuff like zone entries, which is kind of the next big thing. I shouldn't say next big thing because it's been worked on for a while, but zone entries are kind of becoming a bigger thing, as well as Ryan Stimpson's, or at RK Stimps, passing project, which is looking at how shot assists, and what I mean by a shot assist is it's the pass that leads to a shot, and whether or not the pass immediately before or two passes before, and how that kind of helps impact a lot of what we're looking at. And so I think that passing project is probably one of the next big things to keep an eye out for. And so again, that's at RK Stimp. He's always looking for new trackers. The tracking takes about 2-3 hours per game. But even if you're able to chip in 1 or 2 games for him, it's a fantastic resource, so I'd highly recommend checking that out. But between the passing project and the zone entries, which if you're looking for zone entry tracking, you have at Shutdown Line, at J. Dylan Burke. Both of them do a fantastic, phenomenal job with their tracking. They make simple definitions that are easy to find, and at least with J. Dylan Burke, I've had no issues in terms of obtaining data sheets or learning how to set up a collection form, things of that nature. If you have any interest in that, both Corey and Jay Dillenberg are exceptional references to follow. Jen Costello, who I've already mentioned multiple times, does fantastic work with her tracking. She recently published a fantastic project on kind of shot generation and how these shots come about and whether it's face-offs, controlled zone entries, all these different factors. She does a great job with that. In terms of that data collection, the question was, is it subject to bias? Well, if you've got multiple people tracking data, there is going to be some sort of bias that you can't really exclude, because two people may view a play differently, two people may collect differently. The goal with a lot of these projects, and the reason I specified Ryan, Corey, Jen, and Jay Dillenberg, is because they have such great definitions of what you're looking to collect that I feel like they do very good jobs of limiting the amount of bias that's introduced between trackers. If you look at a data collection form that you get from Ryan, it's probably 30 plus columns with strict definitions of exactly what you're looking to collect, how to collect it. It makes it very simple, and I think it does a great job of reducing bias, but I don't think you can entirely eliminate bias between trackers. Another person who does a great job, who I haven't really seen on tracking projects, is you'll find him over at Broad Street Hockey. It's Charlie. His Twitter handle is at BSHCharlie. He does a fantastic job as well with zone entries. I think he does a little bit more of it by himself. So if you're looking to say that there's less bias, well, there's only one collector, but even then there still could be some sort of bias introduced in terms of how they elect to collect. But Charlie's another fantastic reference. More than happy to explain his work on Twitter. And I think all those people I just mentioned, Ryan, Charlie, Jay Dillon, Jen, Corey, they're all fantastic references for manually tracked work. There's a couple of other larger websites like SportLogic that's kind of tracks data that's not released. And so you can always ask the account for data, and Andrew Berkshire's behind that. He's another contact point, I should say, for that. Not necessarily behind it, but SportLogic is another person. You can ask them for data, and they will generally provide you with the data. But in terms of application to, or in terms of predictive ability and things of that nature, we haven't really been able to evaluate that because it's not publicly available information. So again, you can take what you want from that, but just keep that in mind if you're looking at that data, that while it could be fantastic data, we don't know just at this point because we're not able to publicly evaluate it. They may have done predictive evaluations of it that aren't publicly available, again, so you just have to take all of that with a grain of salt. All right, so probably the biggest question I got asked in terms of the bucket of specific stats was this concept of was the concept of quality of competition versus quality of teammates. And so I've been fairly vocal in saying that quality of teammates is far more important than quality of competition. And I think you'll find a lot of people tend to back that up. But if you want to know where all of that comes from, so the general premise is that if you think about it over the course of a season, the players, so let's take a particular player. Let's take Pavel Datsyuk, or let's take Thomas Tatar, because we don't have Datsyuk here anymore. So the players that Tatar plays with on his own team are likely to be more consistent and remain similar throughout the course of a season than will the different types of competition Tatar sees over the course of a season. And so what I mean by that is one game he may play against a team where that team wants to match strength versus strength. So he's playing top line versus top line. The next game, he may see a situation where a team wants to use a grind line versus a top line, and you end up with a lower caliber player, but potentially a line that's perceived to be a shutdown line playing against Tatar's line. And so what that ultimately all lends itself to is that when you think about every player in the NHL and you look at that measurement of quality of competition, and right now there's two ways to measure it. There's measuring it based on each player's course I4 percentage, and then there's a measurement based on their time on ice percentage. We'll start with the course I4 percentage first. But the thought is that it's not a thought, it's been shown that the variation, and so what I mean by that is you take the player that's got the lowest quality of competition CF percentage, and you take the player that's got the highest quality of competition CF percentage, and the range between those two numbers is pretty small because the quality of competition ultimately gets washed out because players see so many different types of players across an entire season. However, if you look at the range of numbers that happen between the lowest player in terms of quality of teammate course I4 percentage and the highest player in terms of quality for quality of teammates course I4 percentage, it's a much larger variation. There's a much larger range. It usually spans anywhere from somewhere like 41% to as high as 59%, whereas the variation in time on ice or in quality of competition course I4 percentage is a much narrower range, usually something like 48% to 52%. So what we're saying is that the difference between even the player who sees the toughest competition as measured by that stat isn't really dramatically different than the player who sees the lowest in that stat. Whereas if you look at quality of teammates, there's a much larger variation between those numbers, and thus the impact is thought to be much more significant. So the first piece kind of on that I would recommend is done by Eric Tulsky on NHLnumbers.com back in 2012. You can follow Eric Tulsky at NHLEricT on Twitter. And so he did the first piece on that, and that's a fantastic piece on the quality of competition measured as course I4 percentage, and that was done back in 2012. Later that year, he actually published a follow-up piece using time on ice percentage, suggesting that, well, there's a lot of issues using course I4 percentage for a particular player, and so we should consider using time on ice percentage as it's truly reflective of how a coach trusts a player, in terms of saying that if I use a player a lot more and give them a lot more minutes, that's probably more indicative of me thinking that's a better player, and thus if someone's matching up against a guy that's got a high time on ice percentage, that's probably a guy matching up against a better player. And so he measured using that, or he suggests using that method as a way of evaluating quality of competition. Again, the range of variation still isn't dramatic, and thus there's not really, I think the conclusion from that first piece using course I4 percentage was that there's not really players that require an adjustment to their numbers based on quality of competition in that respect. And that's kind of a tough concept for people to understand because, for me, initially I was very much against the thought that I have to think that quality of competition really isn't as important, because I go, well, if I've got a defenseman who's matching up against Sidney Crosby, that's a lot more important than a defenseman who's matching up against Luke Glendening. That's a significant difference. But I think what we have to remember is that while in that one game, that's a significant difference, like I mentioned earlier in my Thomas Tatar example, the next game that defenseman might not be seeing that player, or that forward might not be seeing that top line opponent. He might be seeing a bottom line opponent, and that over the course of a season, it tends to wash itself out. There has been one alternative thought to that was published this year by OMG It's Domi, and that was published on Hockey Graphs back in March of 2016. And that thought was, well, what if time on ice isn't the right way to measure it? What if course I4 percentage isn't the right way to measure it? What if we just measure it for a defenseman? What if we measure the points scored by that player? Because while it might be, it might be indicative that a player generates a lot of shots or is on the ice for a lot of time, what they do in that amount of time might be more indicative of a better player. And so what OMG and Stomey found was that you have actually a much wider variation in numbers collected. Actually, there was a 34% capture rate compared to some of the other statistics used. And the thought is that might that might actually show a little bit more benefit to using quality of competition. Not necessarily that, and saying that we can't dismiss it. I don't think, based on those results, we can say that it supersedes quality of teammates at this point in time. But I think based on those results, we can't necessarily dismiss it. It's just probably not as important of a factor where we're at right now. But that's another great piece that's linked for you below. I would highly recommend reading it. He uses a case study of Martin Marincin, a Maple Leafs defenseman, as he transitioned from Edmonton to Toronto this past year. I thought it was a great piece to look at. A couple of other pieces to look at. There's another good piece on hockey graphs from Garrett Hull looking at binning, basically taking players and dropping them into different bins based on roles, looking at quality of teammates and versus quality of competition. Again, concluding that we can't necessarily dismiss quality of competition, but it's still likely not as big of a factor in a player's overall results as quality of teammates is. And that's kind of where we're at in terms of this quality of teammates versus quality of competition debate. I would say where we're at right now is that quality of teammates is still going to be a little bit more important than quality of competition, but I don't think you can necessarily dismiss quality of competition entirely. You just have to recognize that it shouldn't be weighted above something like quality of teammates or other more predictive factors. Another, this is kind of a bonus since I wasn't necessarily asked about it, but I just thought I would chat about zone starts real quick. So a lot of people like to cite zone starts, specifically this zone start ratio, which kind of takes offensive versus defensive zone starts. One of the issues with doing that that you want to be careful of is the zone start numbers that are reported by a lot of locations are only face-off zone starts. So remember, not every shift from a player starts off of a face-off. And actually, it's roughly 50% of a player's shifts start off of a face-off. The other 50% tend to start on the fly. So if you ignore all those on-the-fly shifts, you're really only looking at 50% of a player's shifts. And so yes, while they may start a lot of shifts in the defensive zone, those are really only off of face-offs, and it's kind of ignoring all those on-the-fly starts and kind of making the difference seem a lot bigger than it truly is. And so where you can find on-the-fly information is on Corsica under the context report. Manny actually publishes the on-the-fly shifts, and so you can hand calculate what a player's true defensive zone start percentage is by also lumping in on-the-fly shifts, and you realize that the variation isn't as dramatic. Perhaps maybe for a 10-game or even a 15-game sample like a playoff run, I think someone's variation could be, or someone could have a very high percentage of defensive zone starts, but it would be almost unheard of for them to have a truly high number over the course of a season. So there's a lot of great work published on that. There's work done by Matt Kane. He actually did a 2-part piece published up on puckplusplus.com. Both of those are linked for you there. And he's kind of discussing this debate here for you. Again, because a lot of people like to say, particularly when it comes to someone like Luke Glendening, who, if you look at just those face-off zone starts, they look very poor. But we have to remember that we have to include all of his on-the-fly shifts in there to truly assess or accurately assess his performance. And so, like I said, that's all published on Corsica.hockey. Again, at Ineffective Maths, another great resource on this. He's the one who's really pointed this out to me and kind of made us aware that we have to be a little more diligent in terms of incorporating that on-the-fly shift start when evaluating a player at 5-on-5. We can't really just say that face-off zone starts are it all by itself. Now, if a player has, a very dramatic difference, once you include on-the-fly starts, like I mentioned, that can happen in a small sample size, like a playoff run. That can be very important, but it usually doesn't happen. All right, so now that we've kind of jumped out of some of those specific stats, like quality of competition, quality of zone start, or quality of teammates and zone starts, the next kind of bucket of questions I received related to player evaluation, and the first question I received is, which stats do I prefer to evaluate forwards and defensemen? The first and foremost point I'll bring up is I don't think you can evaluate a player off of a single statistic. I often get asked, what's the single most important statistic to evaluate a player? And I'll tell you that probably their score-adjusted Corsi for percentage is going to be, or available on Corsica.hockey is expected goals for percentage, which is slightly above score adjusted Corsi 4 percentage in terms of predictiveness. And Manny's methods are all published on his website under the blog part of the website, and you can view that there. I would usually lean on that first, but remember that there's a lot of contextual things you want to look at. While they may not be super important, you do want to just take that into consideration. So I will just put that disclaimer. I don't think you can evaluate a player off of a single statistic. You do have to incorporate a little bit more of context. In terms of which stats do I prefer for forwards and defensemen, I like to use relative statistics, and what this means is it's a player's performance relative to his teammates. And so what you're kind of getting at is a player better than team average or worse than team average? Is a player helping the team and help driving that number up, or is he part of the problem and bringing the number down? And I like to use those because I think when I'm comparing players between different systems or even within the same system, I want to make sure I account for system effects. So if I use something like score adjusted Corsi percentage or Corsi 4 percentage, and I look at the LA Kings, who are perennially one of the top couple of teams the last few years in terms of score adjusted Corsi 4 percentage, a lot of their players are going to be really high, have really high numbers. So what I want to do is I want to look relative to the team, how does that particular player perform? So I get a better idea of because that player could still have a 52%, but the team average is like 56%. And so really, while the number is above 50% and it looks good, they're actually performing underneath that team average. So I like to use the relative statistics just to keep that in mind and keep everything in check. And so when I'm talking relative statistics, what I'll use is relative score-adjusted Corsi 4 percentage. I really like to use that. I'll also take a look at relative expected goals for percentage just to see how that looks. I like to also look at what's driving that variable, remembering that both of those are calculated by having numbers for and numbers against. So a player may have a really high score-adjusted Corsi 4 percentage, and that might be because they're an elite shot suppressor. So very few shots happen against them, but they don't really drive offense at a really high rate. But because that bottom number is very low, they end up having a much better number. Or similarly, they could drive a lot of shots for and also give up shots at a fair rate. So I think it's important to know which variable is driving that. So I'll look at relative Corsi 4 per 60 minutes of ice time for that player, as well as relative Corsi 4 Corsi against per 60 minutes of ice time for that player to kind of see which of the variables is driving that, driving the result for them. I think that's very good. I also like to look at time on ice percentage just to see a little bit more about roles, see how much ice time they're getting, if they're being used a lot, if they're being sheltered a lot. I will look at quality of teammates as well. I want to include that in there. And then I like to look at their overall zone start percentage. And the other cool piece of information that's available on Corsica.hockey is also where a player tends to finish his shifts. So that's kind of important. You can see if they start a lot of shifts in the defensive zone and they finish a lot of shifts in the offensive zone, they are probably driving the puck up the ice. Whereas vice versa, if they start a lot of shifts in the offensive zone and they're finishing a lot of shifts in the defensive zone, well, they're actually getting driven back. And so I think that's another interesting thing to look at when we're talking about forwards in particular. When we come to defensemen, it's a little tougher. I think the rates, I will look at score-adjusted Corsi 4 percentage. I do think it's a bit more challenging because a lot of the shots against a player tend to happen as part of the systems, and so that's why I like to look at relative numbers. I think systems tend to dictate a lot of the shots against, and so a great example of this is 2 years ago, Danny DeKeyser under Mike Babcock was I believe a top 5 defenseman in the NHL in terms of Corsi against, in terms of high danger chances against, which is a metric that was available on War on Ice, which has now gone dark, which kind of dictated shot location. So where did different shots come from, and was it a high danger area, which was mainly talking about the area of the ice in the slot and in front of the crease. And so Danny DeKeyser was absolutely stellar in that statistic, but the fact is Mike Babcock's system is actually a very, very good system at limiting shots against. And so what we saw this season is as we transitioned to Jeff Blashill, it wasn't anything spectacular. And what we could have seen is had we looked at relative numbers last year, relative to his teammates, DeKaiser wasn't having a spectacular season. He was having kind of an average season relative to his teammates. And so I think that was something we could have seen coming up, that perhaps his shot suppression numbers would bottom out a little bit. So I think that's kind of a good example of why I like to use the relative statistics, and why you have to be a little bit careful of just using plain Corsi against per 60 for defensemen within a system, especially if you're comparing across a system. It's important to note that systems have a big impact on the shots against that happen for a player. So with defensemen, I use a lot of the same variables. I do like to see quality of competition here as well, because the range does tend to be bigger for defensemen than it does for forwards. So I do like to look at that, and that kind of information is available from at Behind the Net several years ago. I don't know if you can still get to the articles. I was having trouble getting to them today. They used to be published up on Arctic Ice Hockey, which is one of the SB Nation sites, but I was having trouble getting back to those today. So, but at Behind the Net's a great person to follow on Twitter as well for good updates. So, overall, I'll say I usually look at relative score-adjusted Corsi for percentage. I like to look at the variables that make up that. So, relative Corsi for percentage, or Corsi for per 60, relative Corsi against per 60. I do also like to look at expected goals and the breakdown relative to that. I do like to look at quality of teammates. I will usually look at quality of competition just to make sure. Or I like to include it just because there is still that misconception about how important it truly is, and potentially, people will think the evaluation is incomplete if that's not included. I do also throw in the true zone start percentage, including on the fly shifts, just to make sure that that's accounted for if there is a defenseman that does start like 25% of his shifts in the defensive zone, even when I include on the fly shifts. That's kind of a big number, 25-30%, somewhere in that realm. So I would also include that. I like to look at primary points per 60. And so what primary points do is they exclude secondary assists. So it's only looking at the primary assist and the goals scored. And I like to look at all of these only at 5-on-5. I should have made that disclaimer initially. Even strength tends to be the biggest. So even strength is the biggest amount of ice time that's going to happen during a game. It's 5-on-5. It's even play. I like to look at power play time separately and penalty kill time separately. I don't like to look at total together. I like to look at each bucket separately, except for when I'm talking about time on ice. So bringing it back, so with all of those 5-on-5 statistics, I like to look at that 5-on-5 primary points per 60 minutes of ice time for a player. And the reason I tend to exclude secondary assists is, one, we don't know how much is attributed to skill at this point in time. There is information suggesting that some skill is involved in terms of accumulation of secondary assists. However, I'm not really sure what the total impact is at this point in time, and so I tend to not look at that right now. And actually, at Ineffective Maths makes these great scoring charts that labels secondary assists as noise right now. Because we don't really know what to make of it, but it probably isn't related to as much skill as something like a primary assist or a goal, and it can actually be largely related to how the NHL collects and tracks secondary assists, which makes it a little bit difficult for us to evaluate. So I like to look at that primary points per 60 just to see how a player tends to drive the offense, because if a guy's got a lot of reduced ice time, their raw numbers may not look great, but on a per 60 basis, they may actually look very, very good. So an example of this is a guy like Thomas Tatar, who at even strength, his numbers don't look anything like they did, or I should say his total numbers for the season at all ice time don't look anything like they did last year, but his 5-on-5 primary points per 60 was actually very similar to last year. And we can realize that the reason for his scoring drop was related to the poor performance on the power play. So that's another important evaluator for both forwards and defensemen. So I guess to bring it all back one more time, my variables that I like to use are relative score-adjusted course I4 percentage, relative score-adjusted course I4 per 60, relative score-adjusted course I against per 60, relative expected goals for percentage, relative expected goals for per 60, relative expected goals against per 60, 5-on-5 primary points per 60, 5-on-5 time on ice per 60, 5-on-5 quality of teammates, time on ice percentage, 5-on-5 quality of competition, time on ice percentage, and then the true zone start percentage. And I think that all gives you a fair idea of where a player is. And that kind of leads me into the segue that is the next question, which is probably the most important question with how popular these have become. It's how do you evaluate a hero chart? And so for those of you that aren't familiar with hero charts, they are charts created by Dominic Gallimini, and I'm hoping I'm not butchering his last name. And basically, they're available at ownthepuck.blogspot.com, and it's the term hero stands for horizontal evaluative rankings optic, or HERO charts, and he has them available for forwards and for defensemen. And so using those statistics we talked about, he provides you the option of being able to evaluate a single player or compare two players against each other to see how they perform, and you can even change the seasons. So first off, with the charts, underneath the player's name, you have a designated role. And where that role comes from is it's a function of their ice time and difference in deployment across score states. And what I mean by that is how much ice time do they receive when they're trailing, how much ice time do they receive when their team is ahead, and you're kind of figuring out how much ice time they're truly being trusted with, and it helps generate these different roles. I would say the roles, to my knowledge, I'm not sure if Dominic has corrected this yet, there was a little bit of issue in that initially when these were rolled out. Players who played a lot on the power play and on the penalty kill may have lower time on ices at 5-on-5 because of and that may be underrepresented or underreported. So take the roles with a little bit of a grain of salt. So at this point, it's not the end-all, be-all, but that's just kind of how that's generated and where that role comes from. Over to the right, you can see weighting of past performance. So even if you click a year like, let's say, 2016, there's still weighting of 2013, 2014, 2014, 2015, and then 2015, 2016. And the weighting of each season increases as we move forward in time to kind of help us predict how they're going to do or how they're going to go in the future. And so all of the data here comes from Corsica.hockey. And so the first thing you'll see is at the top you'll have these composite wowies. And so what wowie means is with or without you. And so what it shows is first course I4 percentage and then second expected goals for percentage. It shows how a player performs or how line mates perform with the player and then how line mates perform without the player. And so what you would want to see is the blue circle that says line mates with player. You would want that to be further to the right than the orange circle, which is line mates without player. And what that means is that when line mates play with that player, they drive more shots or more expected goals for when they're all on the ice together as opposed to when they're without this particular player. If you have the orange bubble ahead of the blue bubble, it can be indicative that that particular player is maybe being dragged along by his line mates, or he's not doing, or he's maybe dragging down teammates and line mates. So that's something to consider. The bottom part of the chart is performance tiers, and so what he's put up here is he's got his goals per 60, primary assists per 60, their primary points per 60. Then on the right side, there's shot generation, or the relative Corsi for per 60, relative Corsi against per 60, and then productive possession, or CD per 60, which is Corsi differential per 60. And that's just the relative Corsi for per 60 minus the relative Corsi against per 60 to generate a differential between the two numbers. And so looking at that aspect, it's then bucketed into fourth line, third line, second line, and first line production to give you an idea of what level this player is producing at in the amount of ice time they have. None of this here is taking into account quality of competition or zone starts. those are kind of independent metrics that you need to take a look at outside of that if you want for contextual purposes, but this is just that performance tier. And so looking at that, you can see how a player performs if they're a first line in terms of production, or if they're a first line in terms of shot generation or shot suppression or productive possession. So you can kind of get an idea of actual production, and you can get an idea of possession as well. And the very bottom part of the chart is performance tier probabilities for the following season. And what this is intended to do is give you an idea of what their individual production will be like in the next season, and what their productive possession will be like in the next season, and what kind of bucket they fall into. It helps you get an idea of potentially how a player may be moving forward. And so these can be a really good evaluation tool, especially if you're not familiar with a player. Like I mentioned, there are a couple of contextual things that are left out, which you can use and kind of supplement to this. Dominic has actually put together a piece. It's on his old version of the hero charts, but there's still a lot of the same information there on Own the Puck, and I've hyperlinked that for you below. It's not based on this version here, but it's based on the older version, which still included a lot of these statistics. My biggest thing with this is you should be just mindful about taking the rolls with just a bit of grain of salt. Again, this may be a piece of incorrect information, but to my knowledge, I'm not sure if that's been adjusted yet. And then you should also just take a look at some of the context clues behind it, just to give you a thorough idea of everything that player is going for. So I would say these are a great place to start, and these are a great place to familiarize yourself with a player that you're not familiar with. It's an excellent tool, and the hockey community is very thankful to Dominic for putting these together, because these are absolutely exceptional. So moving away from hero charts, another question I got asked is kind of what elements of hockey would I measure, analyze, or publicize if I had infinite resources and infinite tools? And I think this is a fantastic question, because there's so many different projects out there that I would love to be able to participate in. But sometimes, for me, it's just a limitation of the amount of time or the amount of resources I have. And so probably the first thing I would say is getting an idea of puck battles. And so puck battles, how often does a player win it? How often do puck battles lead to zone clears? How often do puck battles lead to shots for in the offensive zone? How often does it lead to meaningful possession? Things of that nature. I think puck battles is kind of an untapped resource right now, and there's so many of them that happen within a single game. There's so many players involved. There's so many things going on. And it's one step that we right now aren't including in a lot of our evaluations. I think that could be a fantastic thing to track. It would just be very, very difficult at this point in time with the resources that I have to be able to do that. A couple of other things that I am trying to work on and will hopefully get to at this point in time is defenseman pinching. And what I mean by that is how often does a defenseman stand up in the offensive zone to try and maintain possession? How often does that defenseman get burned and lose that battle? But also, how often does that defenseman win that battle and keep possession alive? And then how many shots are generated off of a defenseman keeping the puck in play? Because one of the biggest things I see is that a lot of defensemen get villainized for a bad pinch when a chance goes the other way. But how many shots are truly generated off the chance the other way? How many goals are generated off of that? But at the same time, we don't often recognize when a defenseman makes a great pinch to keep the puck in, and then zone time's extended at that point. I think that could be something really, really neat to look at. And that's something I'm working on, because a defenseman like Erik Karlsson gets villainized for not playing defense. But what happens if he doesn't have to play defense as much because he does such a great job of keeping the puck in play in the offensive zone? What if he's limiting the number of minutes that he really has to spend in the defensive zone, and therefore when he makes a mistake, it's highlighted? Something along those lines. I want to take a look into that. I'm trying to devise my tracking sheet for that to figure out what variables need to be included and what's the best stuff to include at that point. So that's something I definitely want to look at. And then goalies, it's kind of an untapped, I shouldn't say untapped. There's a lot of information out there. It's tough to interpret, and it's kind of tough to draw a lot of strong conclusions from. And so there's a lot of information out there. We've seen like Steve Valiquette's Royal Road project, which looks at passes that cross center or that cross through the slot and how that impacts the chance of the puck going in. Then we've got Nick Mercadante's adjusted goals saved above average, or we've got his goals saved above average, and then his adjusted goals saved above average metric, which kind of looks at adjusting for shot location. And kind of determining which goalies do better saving shots above average. And then Ian Fleming, or at Ian Fleming 16 on Twitter, who I would highly recommend, great follow as well, is working on adjusted goals saved above average or goals saved above expected goals against, to kind of give us a different method of looking at goaltenders. And that's another thing to consider. I think goalies, for me, having never really played goalie at a high level, I don't have a great idea of a lot of the variables that need to be considered when evaluating a goaltender. But I would love if we could ever come up with a way to evaluate goaltenders better, and I don't know if we can. I think a lot of evaluating goaltenders is still tough to draw strong conclusions from at this point. I do think you can use the information to a certain degree, but I do think there's a lot of areas where it's still tough to draw really strong conclusions and say something definitively about a goaltender unless they're one of the truly elite guys. All right, so that kind of... Well, actually, I got one more question about player evaluation related to, is there a good way to see if a player tends to do better with more or less ice time? To my knowledge, there is not a method that would say, okay, if they had 20 minutes as opposed to 15 minutes, this is how they would do. I think what we can use right now to help say it's worth a shot is our rate statistics, which I mentioned before. It's numbers measured per 60 minutes of ice time to help account for large discrepancies in ice time for a player. And I think if a player performs really well in a rate sample, you could argue that what would happen if they got a bigger time on ice, a bigger role, and see how that goes. I think you can make the argument that it should be tried at that point, but I don't think I have a method, or I'm not aware of any method that can say this player will be better in a larger sample based on what we have right now. Again, I could be completely wrong on that. Like I've mentioned many, many times here, I'm not an expert on anything. My goal here is just to kind of help bring people up to basic speed and get a little bit more comfortable with analytics. So if there is something out there, I would absolutely love someone to kind of correct me on that. All right, so we'll move into the last couple of buckets here. One question I got asked is what data tends to be highly correlated between the eye test and analytics. So the question's asking, we poke fun a lot of time at the eye test, and particularly the example I always bring up is a lot of you probably remember going to the dentist's office and pulling out those highlights magazines. And in those highlights magazines, there's always those pictures. There's like identify, or it was like look at the picture for 30 seconds, look away, and then answer these questions on the next page about the picture. And how many of you actually got everything right about the picture? And keep in mind, you were looking at a piece of paper, nothing was moving, and you had a full 30 seconds, and you were told to memorize everything on it. And then you looked away briefly, nothing to do to make you forget anything, and you just had to answer a couple of questions. Well, at least for me, I barely got half of those questions right, if it. And there was always, I would look back at the picture and go, wow, I never even noticed that. So then I always say, well, how do we say that the eye test captures everything for hockey? Because now I'm not talking about a piece of paper that's standing still and I'm looking at it for 30 seconds, told to memorize everything. I'm now looking at a 200-foot by 85-foot ice rink with 12 players on it, 10 of them who can reach top speeds of 20, 25 miles an hour, moving a puck that can be shot upwards of 100 miles an hour. And then I've got players changing on the fly that I've got to keep my eye out for. I've got goaltender movements I got to keep my eye out for. And then all of that's going to happen for 60 minutes. And so I struggle to say how anyone can go, I remember more than really 5%, and even 5% is kind of a large number. How do you remember 5% of the things that happened in that game? Because remember, there's so many different events going on that are all related into these statistics. And that's just my little bit of a disclaimer on why I think people who say the eye test is the only way to go, I think that's a struggle. Even a scout, I would say maybe a scout would get no more than 5% of all the events right if I administered a test at the end of the game, and I administered a test with 100 questions. I would not imagine a scout getting more than 5 right. What we tend to remember are the big events that led to memorable things. So what we remember are the goals against. What we remember are the phenomenal saves, but we don't remember that routine save. We don't remember that poke check that led to that goal. We don't remember anything along those lines. And so that's what I'm trying to say. We remember the goal happened and who scored it, but you don't remember the 25 things that led up to that goal. And so that's where I think analytics can kind of help capture that. So I'll get off my soapbox really quick, and we'll go back into the question. What data are highly correlated with the eye test? It's kind of tough to say, really, because I'm not sure of some of the large eye test conclusions. I think when it comes to a truly generational player like Sidney Crosby, the eye test absolutely backs up, or analytics absolutely backs up the conclusions drawn from the eye test. He's a phenomenal all-around player, absolute stud. And I think when it comes to kind of those types of players, we can say that. But even to a certain degree, like Shea Weber's a player of late who has become very, 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 very divisive between eye test and analytics. We had a lot of the eye test people say that the Canadians won that Subban-Weber deal for getting Weber, whereas a lot of the analytics people were going, I can't believe that happened. Nashville fleeced them for PK Subban. I'm not really familiar with a whole lot of things that tend to line up, except for when we're evaluating a truly generational talent like Sidney Crosby. It is tough. I think we have to marry both because even as much as I love analytics, I do a lot of systems work at Winging and Motown, and I would never turn down the opportunity to be like, hey, let me pick the brain of Dominic Hasek. I would love to pick his brain and learn from him and what he does. I would love to pick the brain of Nick Lindstrom, and things he tells me I would absolutely revere, but I would want to make sure I backed it up with data to kind of understand where he's coming from. And I think when we do a little bit of that marriage, it helps people be more comfortable with the conclusions as well as helps people understand a little bit better. So that's just my eye test versus analytics comments that I'll make. Now I'm just going to jump into specific Red Wings questions that I was asked. So any interesting statistical anomalies regarding certain players on the Red Wings? Yeah, there's a whole bunch that I could dive into. I'll kind of limit it to a few. One is Justin Abdelkader on the power play. So interestingly enough, last year he led the NHL in penalties taken while on the power play, and it wasn't even close. I think he actually took 15 penalties while the Wings were in 5-on-4 situations last year, compared to, I think the next highest was 10. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. He also was one of the top players in terms of shots that were blocked when he was on the ice. Not necessarily saying he blocked them, but that was just an interesting thing, wondering if he is the right guy to be using on the penalty or on the power play at 5-on-4. I thought that was very interesting. On a positive note for Abdelkader, he was one of the top 3 forwards in the NHL last year in terms of limiting shots against while shorthanded. So a lot of Red Wings fans like to say Drew Miller, Luke Glendening, these are our elite penalty killers. But really, actually, Justin Abdelkader was, I believe, 3rd in the NHL or even 1st in the NHL. I'm probably forgetting, but I know he was top 3 in terms of shots against while shorthanded. And what I mean by shots against is when I say shots, I'm including shots on goal, block shots, missed shots. Like when he was on the ice, the Wings penalty kill did not give up a lot of shots. They didn't give up a lot of goals. He was phenomenal last year on the penalty kill, and I would think that if Detroit wanted to maximize his talents a little bit, maybe minimize his power play role and maximize his penalty kill role, because he did really well on it last year, and it might be something worth seeing moving forward. Let's see, a couple other questions. So why is Brendan Smith good, but Jakob Kindl bad? So this was a big question that came up when the Wings moved Kindl, because a lot of the non-Red Wings people were throwing around Kindl's hero chart saying, look, Kindl is a good defenseman, and the Wings got fleeced for retaining salary, giving up a pick, or getting a 6th-round pick, and that's it for Kindl. Here's my take. We say Kindl is bad, but why do we say he's bad? It's based on the eye test. We say he's bad because we remember him batting the puck into the net during the playoffs against the Blackhawks. That is bad. I will never forget that. I will never forgive him for that. But when we pull it all back together, is he as bad as we make him out to be? Because the metrics that we look at, he drove possession, the Wings scored more when he was on the ice, and he did a lot of good things. I just think a lot of those negatives were really memorable negatives in really memorable situations, and thus we were always colored of our opinions of him. Similarly, Brendan Smith gets a similar reputation, and probably the biggest difference and the reason why I didn't fight for Kindl as much is, one, my own biases that I was subjected to from remembering all those gaffes. Even Brendan Smith, it took a long time for me to get over the fact that he touched a puck when he was on the bench. I thought that was just the stupidest thing ever. But I have to remember, I can't hold one time doing that as a negative marker on his play. And so when I'm putting them all together, I do think Brendan Smith is slightly better than, or a little bit better than Jakob Kindl. I thought he had a bigger possession impact on the Wings last year, and the analytics kind of bear that out. It wasn't by a whole lot, but it was slightly better. I do think Kindl, had he been given a fair chance, we might have been able to see more from him. I think the reason he's perceived to be bad is largely related to his big gaffes, and he just never got the opportunity. And then the third probably big thing is it's the appeal to authority. So when a coach doesn't play a player, our natural instinct is it's because they're bad. Well, I'm not really sure of any other job in the entire world where someone is 100% right. So I'm a pharmacist, and I have to be 100% right. Am I 100% right? No. I'm not. But I try my best. But for some reason, we believe that an NHL coach is 100% right, in their opinion. Is someone who isn't an NHL coach potentially going to notice something that an NHL coach didn't? Yeah. Why do we have this thought that an NHL coach or an NHL general manager is going to be 100% right in every evaluation they do? Are they more likely to be right? Potentially. But remember, they're using this eye test that I've already told you is very, very flawed in terms of being able to remember everything. They're relying a lot on experience, and I think if we compared eye test to eye test, they're going to be right way more than I'm going to be right, or somebody else is going to be right. But when we introduce analytics, which demonstrate predictiveness and have demonstrated their importance, and we know what we're going to get when we look at those analytics, I think it introduces a different element to where people can actually generate opinions that aren't captured by a coach's or a general manager's eye test. And so I think general managers and coaches are wrong a lot more than than the average fan actually believes. And so because of this appeal to authority that they must be right, except remembering that the majority of them are using this flawed eye test that's not able to remember every event, despite how much they are around hockey, I think that's where that gap happens, and that tends to color a lot of people's opinions. We think Luke Glendenning's great because he's being played in these situations. Our coach tells us he's a hard worker. Our coach tells us his impact on the penalty kill is invaluable, but our metrics tell us otherwise. And so who do you have to trust at that point? And it's very, very tough for people to say, I don't believe that coach. And I think it all has to start with, how do people arrive at their opinion? Because if I was strictly speaking, only out of the eye test, and I'm telling you that somebody's a bad player, you should dismiss me because I am not a professional scout. I am not a professional hockey player. I've never been a professional hockey player, and I never will be a professional hockey player. So my opinion based on that kind of information is not going to be worth holding. But when we have opinions based on numbers and analytics and things of that nature that have shown to be predictive and important, I think that's where we have to recognize that if we're not using that and we're trusting someone who's only using this eye test, regardless of how great it is, I think we're there a lot more wrong than we're willing to admit as fans, and that's why I think these counterintuitive opinion or these counter opinions should be introduced into the mainstream media. We're told Brendan Smith is bad because he touched the puck with his glove on the bench and he gets benched for several games and now everybody hates him. But Brendan Smith was the Wings' best defenseman last year, and it wasn't even close. It wasn't even remotely close. In terms going back to that score-adjusted Corsi for relative to his team's measure last year, Smith actually led the NHL. He was so much better than his teammates that he was the best in the NHL at that. Relative to his teammates, Brendan Smith was the best in the NHL. Now that can say a lot about his teammates being very, very bad, or that can also say that Brendan Smith was good, and it's probably some combination of the two. But it's information like that you would go, wow. My coach has benched him. He benched him for the first couple of games of the playoffs even this year. He must be bad. But we see that when he's on the ice, he's driving possession better than anybody else. And his contextual clues, even though I've told you already, they're not as important in our driving role, and you can click on all those links and kind of get a better feel for why they're not as important. They're not dramatically different from another players on his teams. Yes, DeKaiser got slammed a lot more than Smith in terms of zone starts, but that's really only if you look at face-off zone starts. Compare them when you roll in on the fly, and the percentage gap isn't as dramatic as it once appeared to be when you excluded on the fly shifts. So it's just information like that. And so I think Jakob Kindl was a lot better than we gave him credit for. I don't think he was as good as Brendan Smith, particularly after Smith's numbers this year. Smith actually accelerated this year in terms of his impact relative to his teammates, and I think a large part of it has to do with Jeff Blashill's system. I put up a piece on that back in March on Winging It in Motown. It's definitely a good read. I'm not linking that in this piece here, but if you want to dig back and find it or DM me on Twitter, I'm more than happy to share that piece with you. I think that's a lot of the reason why Smith's caliber of play jumped up relative to his teammates. So explain use of Joachim Andersen with Jeff Blashill saying he's been there before. Again, this is going back to that eye test experience. I've been around the rink. He's been around the rink. This is why we're using him. I can give you zero explanation for why Joachim Andersen was used. The reason cited where he was a good penalty killer and good at face-offs, I think Joachim Andersen took one face-off in the playoffs, if I remember correctly. And one game he played in the first period only. I can't give you an explanation, analytics, or why he was used ahead of Mantha, why he was used ahead of a whole host of other guys. That was a very, very poor decision in my opinion, and I criticized that heavily when that happened. Along the same lines, can you justify the Steve Ott signing? I absolutely cannot justify the Steve Ott signing. The only positive light I can spin is that because the salary is less than $950,000, he can be entirely buried in the AHL if it ends up not working out. But based on quotes from Brendan Savage's latest article today, Jeff Blashill was raving about the impact he'll bring to the locker room. I see it being near impossible that Steve Ott starts the season in the AHL. I think he absolutely starts the season on the Wings. He doesn't bring you anything. There's actually nothing he brings you at this point in time. I mean, people are going to say, oh, he can play power play, he can play penalty kill, he can play all zones. Yeah, you're remembering Steve Ott from 6 years ago. You're not remembering Steve Ott right now. Steve Ott right now is not a very useful player. There's not a whole lot he brings to the table that's measured on ice. Yes, people will cite intangibles and say he's great in the locker room, and that's fine if he's great in the locker room. But when you put a player on the ice, I'm looking at your on-ice performance. And if you're not performing on ice, I don't care what you're doing in the locker room. That sounds a little harsh, but I think that's the fact of the matter, especially when we have a Red Wings team that's not in position to really contend right now. This is a team that really isn't, that has a lot of guys that have very unique, specific roles instead of guys who can play in 3 different situations or 4 different situations. Wings don't have a lot of versatile players. They have a lot of specific players. All right, let's see what else we got. So how does Andreas Athanasiou look from an analytics standpoint? So Athanasiou, from an analytics standpoint, is an interesting case because using the expected goals model that's available on Corsica.hockey, Athanasiou doesn't grade out as well as we would think he grades out. So his score-adjusted Corsi for percentage last year at 5-on-5 was 50.1%. And so that's not a substantially high mark. And then when we look at that relative to his teammates, he was actually one of the worst on the team. He was minus 4.29% in score-adjusted Corsi for percentage. And in terms of expected goals for percentage, he was minus 6.27%, which is a huge number. And so for comparing him to the rest of the players on the Wings, that's not really a good spot for him to be in. So in terms of all the other forwards on Detroit, the relative Corsi for percentage of minus 4.29% was the 3rd worst on the team. The only guys worse were Glendening and Miller. And so that's not a good spot to be in. And then when we go over to the expected goals for percentage, being minus 6.27%, the only guy worse than him was Drew Miller. So what we were seeing with Athanasiou is that he's an incredibly productive player in terms of production this year. But the concern is when you have players who are very productive in production but not in possession, there's the concern that something influenced them or they just kind of had a better season than expected. And so when we look at Athanasiou's relative on-ice shooting percentage, and what I mean by that is all the shots that were taken when he was on the ice, including shots on goal, missed shots, block shots, if we look at the percentage of those that actually went in, Athanasiou relative to his teammates was plus 2.04%, which was the best mark on his teammates. The next closest was Dylan Larkin at plus 1.37%. Only Athanasiou, Larkin, and Tatar are the only guys above 1%, plus 1%. So what you can see from that mark is that Athanasiou benefited from a really high on-ice shooting percentage. So at least in my concern, you've already got people pegging him for 30 goals next year or more. I think we're at the case where he probably benefited from a really high shooting percentage. Not many people can drive that high shooting percentage. So what I'm expecting to see is a similar regression to what we saw from Gus Nyquist a couple of years ago when Nyquist scored 28 goals, but he was shooting 19%. I think you'll see a similar regression from Athanasiou on that front in terms of 5-on-5 performance. I don't really know if we're going to see the same upward trend as everyone or what everyone wants to see. I think there's a lot of question marks surrounding that. He's got a lot of flags that would make me hesitate from saying, yes, he's going to keep trending upwards for the next couple of years. The other interesting to note, dating back to that question about what data is highly correlated with the eye test, Athanasiou was abysmal in terms of shot suppression this year. He was by far on the ice for a very high amount of shots again. So he was, like I stated earlier, second worst in terms of relative shots against at plus 6.57% more shots against. In terms of expected goals against, he was in the same bucket at plus 0.84%, which was the worst on the team. Worse than Drew Miller, worse than Luke Glendening, worse than everybody. He was the worst on the team. So those are very, very concerning numbers for me. Jeff Blashill was absolutely right in saying that there is defensive concern. Everyone got a little up in arms when they were saying, oh, Athanasiou was used on the penalty kill. I think defense at 5-on-5 and defense on the penalty kill are very different situations. So that's a bit concerning. I'm not going to hold a whole lot against him because remember, we are still talking about a very small sample size. We're talking only about 300 minutes at 5-on-5. Which is a very, very small sample size, not a lot of games. Still talking about a 21-year-old. This is a kid that probably has a lot of room for growth, but I would temper my expectations severely for Athanasiou next year. Also depending on what kind of role he's going to get. We don't know what kind of role he's going to get. All right, a Red Wings analytics darling that's not named Brendan Smith. Well, you people know me so well. If I'm going to say analytics darling, it's going to be Teemu Pulkkinen. Pulkkinen has always graded out very highly in the Corsi numbers, and a lot of people say, well, that's just because, he shoots the puck so much that, of course, his on-ice Corsi numbers are going to look inflated because, he's the guy that's shooting the puck so much. Well, actually, if we even look at expected goals for percentage relative to his team, which takes into account a few different variables about the shot, not necessarily shot quality, because we can't truly capture that yet, but a couple more variables about the actual shot. Pulkkinen was still second on the team in relative goals for percentage, only to Datsyuk last year. When he's on the ice, shots tend to go in favor of the Red Wings, and chances tend to go in favor of the Red Wings. He's been a very productive player, and I think a lot of people's opinions are, again, colored by the fact that he couldn't crack the lineup towards the end of the year, and we find out again that he had another shoulder surgery. So this is now, I think, 2 or 3 shoulder surgeries. He injured his shoulder back in December, but if we remember before that, he had 7 goals, including a multi-goal game against Carolina in the opening game in those first few games of the season. So he was definitely performing very well, and then he just never got back into the lineup. Part of that seems to be related to this injury. Part of that is, coaching preference, and now all the narratives about he's small, he can't play, things of that nature are all coming out. But, it's kind of tough. Pulkkinen, for the last 3 years, is in the top 20 players in the NHL in terms of 5-on-5 score-adjusted Corsi for percentage. It's kind of ridiculous to grade him out the way we grade him out right now. And just say, he's small, he can't skate. These are all narratives driven by the coach. And while the coach is going to be the best one to be able to evaluate that, I don't think it's a really fair narrative for Teemu Pulkkinen. Especially because if we go over the last 3 years and we take all Red Wings forwards who played, let's say, at least 500 minutes at 5-on-5, which is a very, very small amount, very small sample size. I should be introducing a lot of players here who have small sample sizes. So they're going to way influence this. Pulkkinen ranks 4th over the last 3 years, and this is an aggregated sample, so it includes 2013, 2014, 2014, 2015, 2015, 2016. He ranks 4th in terms of 5-on-5 goals per 60 minutes. And these are his individual goals, not Red Wings goals. So he scores 0.78 goals per 60 minutes of ice time for him. So that's 4th among all Red Wings forwards over the last 3 years. The guys ahead of him are Dylan Larkin at 1.03, Thomas Tatar at 1.02, and Gus Nyquist at 0.9. But Pulkkinen's ahead of Datsyuk, he's ahead of Advocator, he's ahead of Zetterberg, he's ahead of Franzen, he's ahead of every other Red Wings forward. It's kind of ridiculous that he's gotten pinned down the way he has, and the Wings are probably going to lose him this offseason, given that he's a restricted free agent, still unsigned, had shoulder surgery, several months out. I expect him to be dealt. And that's going to be really disappointing because I think he's the guy that we saw his development get severely impacted. And he's a guy who probably could have produced a little bit more had he been given a true opportunity. Because remember, even though I'm including 3 years worth of data, I've only got 70 games. That's not even a full season yet. And yet people are so quickly ready to dismiss his talent and dismiss him, which is kind of sad. All right. I think that concludes all the stats questions I got asked. I got asked one non-stats question because I do post a lot about beer. What are my beers of choice? So overall beer of choice, for a long time it was the Heady Topper IPA, which is brewed by The Alchemist up in Vermont. But this past summer, back in May, I had the opportunity to go to Hill Farmstead and actually visit the brewery up there. And, I had never heard of it, but if you actually Google Hill Farmstead, it's apparently won the #1 brewery in the world, but 3 of the last 4 years. And I went up there, and on that particular day, they just so happened to have their one of their stouts called the Edward, but they had brewed it with cocoa nibs. And to this day, that's still the best beer I've ever had. If I could have a lifetime supply of that would be fantastic. But that's right now the #1 overall beer that I have. In terms of style of beer, I'm a really big coffee chocolate porter stout person, as well as a IPA person. So in the winters, I get very big into the coffee chocolate stouts. There's a lot of really, really good ones. My favorite right now, there's a Terrapin variety pack where they actually brew 4 different stouts using different coffee beans. And so they use some from Kona, Hawaii, they use some from Ethiopia, they use some from Guatemala, they use some from Sumatra to brew 4 distinctly different coffee stouts. And that's probably one of my favorite coffee stouts right now, for sure. I think that's definitely up there. Summertime, I'm a big IPA guy, so if I can snag my Heady Topper or the High Alive from Cigar City, that's a really good IPA that I like. A lot of really, really solid IPAs. I've still yet to get to Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. If you know how to get it and would like to get it to me, that would be wonderful. Please let me know. But that's still on the list. So that's kind of all the beers I've got. I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, please continue to ask me. I love to try and do my best to teach and help and provide examples when necessary. If you have any questions or if you think something I said was probably not 100% correct, again, let me know. Like I said, I'm not any expert here. I'm just trying to translate information into a more lay terms to make it a little more accessible and easy to understand. So again, please let me know. I appreciate you all flooding the site with questions and flooding my account, JJ, Kyle, all with great questions. I really, really appreciate it. And if this is something you found helpful, potentially we'll consider doing it again in the future. All right, thanks.